I just bought 37 diaries that belonged to a soldier of the First World War. As I began reading them and researching them, I knew I was going to be shocked by what he wrote from the Western Front at Loos and the Somme, with stories of shelling, shrapnel and sickness in the trenches. As I looked closer into his life told through these diaries, I discovered that I had a lot in common with him, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in one of the final diary entries. I bought this box of diaries at a book fair recently. They belong to a man I'd never heard of before, and you will never have heard of him either. His name was William Henry Tapp. There's no Wikipedia article about his life, there's been no books written about him, but the story of his life found in these diaries is extraordinary. He was a surveyor and a skilled map maker, and we're going to discover what happened when this map maker was pulled across an ocean, across a continent, and into war. This is the first diary. It's for the year 1912. And it opens not at the start of the year, but in August with an entry on Wednesday the 7th that simply says, "My new life begins." In these early diary entries, we learn of his life in Quebec, in Canada. And in these early entries, we hear how he's travelled to Canada from England and he set up his own map making and surveying business, and he spends most of his time contouring areas of Quebec. And the next diary, the one for 1913, starts on a positive note. If we read the diary entry for Wednesday, the 1st of January 1913, it says, "I was married today in Quebec Cathedral at 9 a.m. The woman that he married was called Ava, and we learn much more about him and her and their relationship throughout this year. When he's away with work, traveling around Quebec, doing this contouring to make his maps, he writes about how he misses his wife. And the diary also records world events. On the 11th of February 1913, he writes that he's heard of Captain Scott's death on his return from the South Pole. He worked a lot, had a young business, and dedicated an awful lot of time to it. And what he would do as a surveyor and a map maker is he'd take what's called a plane table out with him to these locations and use that to sketch his surveys. But at the end of that year, business struck. He got wronged in a number of business deals and fell upon very hard times. And so both William and Ava had to return to England. Our next diary is for the year 1914, and he starts this year in England with Ava, having left Canada after the failure of his business. But on the 10th of March 1914, they're back in Quebec. Ava's family are from Canada, she was born there, and he's ready to give his work another go. And as I'm reading through these daily entries, you can really feel the stress and the responsibility on him of providing for his family, making this young business work. And his wife is incredibly supportive of him, and he records that throughout the diaries. But there's certainly times where he feels very alone. But in the summer of 1914, his world changed, just like the world of so many people at that time. There's one entry in August 1914 that has a black cross next to it. You can see that here, and that black cross is for the declaration of war. Over the next few weeks, he is desperate for news of the war. August 13th, 1914, no news, fair anxious to get to the war. August 14th, no news. August 15th, wish I could get news of war. And with no news forthcoming, he joins the English reservists in Quebec. There's an entry at the end of August here saying reported for duty immediately with the English reservists. And he works with the reservists over the coming days. But his luck came in the 5th of September, and finally he could get what he wanted and sail to Europe to join the war effort. He leaves Canada on Saturday, the 5th of September 1914, and he arrived in Liverpool 2 weeks later on the 18th. He had a very special role to play in the conflict. He had a relative, a man called Sir Hugh Dalrymple Fanshawe, who was a commanding officer in the British Army, and he secured a commission for him to go and do map making and surveying work on the Western Front. Weeks after he arrived in England, and just days after his wife Ava arrived to join him, he was sent to France. In France, his diary entries grow longer and more detailed. He fell ill very early after his arrival in France, and on the 4th of December wrote, "This is getting serious. Dear God, how sad I am. Such capacity and no health." By Christmas, he was reporting for duty again, and just before Christmas, he received a gift from his wife Ava, and that was this, which would be his pocket diary for the next year, for 1915. And you can see here that it's inscribed by Ava, December 17th, 1914, to my husband Bill, from his loving wife, Ava Tapp. Tapp's work on the Western Front was as a map maker and surveyor, and this was incredibly dangerous. He would map and contour battlefields and present these plans to senior officers. But in order to do this, he would take that plane table right into the front of the trenches, sometimes putting it on top of the parapet in order to make accurate sketches. And this put him directly in the line of fire and subject to rifle shots, shelling, and shrapnel. In September 1915, he arrived at the Battle of Loos and was under the command of the leader of the British Army, Field Marshal Haig. On the 25th of September, he writes, "Work around Loos under hot fire, making special sketches for Haig of Hill 70 at the back of Loos." The next day, he writes, "Work around Loos. Hit amongst dead bodies, plane tabling, hot fire, dead horses." The next day, work around Loos, recommended for MC, the military cross, lying behind dead bodies for survey. And then on the 30th of December, he writes, "Got my MC." The military cross was a high honour to achieve, and William received his for conspicuous gallantry. His gallantry was because he took his plane table and his surveying equipment to the front of the trenches so that he could fix observation points and correct contours on Hill 70. It's hard to think of a man doing this and setting up his work right there in the line of fire, and I can't even conceive of that kind of bravery. But that wasn't the only instance of it. Just a couple months later, in November, he was again making plans at Loos and writes about how shells were falling all around him every second. The following day, he was at Givenchy, a small village south of Loos, and he writes simply, "Wounded at Givenchy." When we move into the next diary, the one for 1916, we see that these acts of bravery and gallantry and putting himself right in the line of fire were not one-offs. In February, he writes how he was hit by a shell while he was working. But also at this time, we get a different type of diary entries, ones in which he's incredibly dissatisfied with senior officers. And that's because they were trying to push him out of his role as a map maker and bring in new people to do it instead. People who didn't have the formal training and background that he did. And this left him utterly heartbroken. He writes here on the 26th of February, "May the Lord help me to bear it. Here I've made an office, and behold, in comes a stranger and tears it all from me as if it were his. Like a thief in the night, he comes to steal. All enthusiasm is dead. I feel like a traitor. I walk, but falteringly and much distressed. May God help me in my distress." This was a man who was consistently putting his life on the line to use his skills and his talent to do dangerous work. He was back at Loos in March and writes, "At 1, shells were falling around in front and behind us. At 2, all was quiet. At 3, we were both sniped and bombed. I expected every moment to get one right on the head. However, we stuck to the job and successfully completed it. The positions all plot excellently. But that same man, 2 weeks later, writes, "Cease to wear the MC as it isn't really worth having." He continues to work under this extraordinary pressure and unbelievable conditions. On March 22nd, he writes that he was mentioned in dispatches for his bravery, and later that year, he was at the Somme, that great killing ground of the war. And in the entries for mid-July, I found myself looking at this page and then turning it over and seeing the handwriting change markedly. It's now thin, it's straggly, it's unsure of himself. And that's because on the 19th of July it says, "Hit at 10:15 a.m. by rifle bullet and grenade rifle. Carried to dressing station at Venelle, where my wounds were seen to. Was unconscious till midnight when I first remember being awoken on the operating table." The next day we learned that just after midnight, 30 minutes after midnight, he was operated on by a doctor called Mackenzie and came to consciousness in a fit. But the operation worked. He survived. The next day, very sick, awful head. And he writes of his movements between different clearing stations over the following weeks until eventually he gets to Boulogne and gets a ship to a hospital in England, in Dover. He's there on his own for 2 days because his wife didn't get the message that he was back, but Ava then arrives on the 18th of August and stays with him until his release. William didn't keep a diary in 1918 or 1919, but we know from records that he was wounded. He never returned to service and was discharged because of his injuries in 1920. His next diary is for that year, for 1920, and it opens with a long message on the 1st of January. Here it says, "This is the beginning of my 8th year of married life, my first in serious business. Chucked by the army, I have now only a mutilated body and my honour to rely on." Between the wars, he worked as a cartographer and surveyor, even as a car salesman for a time, and wrote a book on ceramics. But tragically, his marriage seemed to break down in the interwar years. On December 19th, 1931, he writes the entry, "Ava married Alexander Anderson, barrister." The diaries between the war, with that exception, are simple records of work and social life, appointments, lunches, dinners, who he's writing to, who he's seeing. But this little diary, still with its pencil sticking out of it, is for the year 1939. And on the 3rd of September for that year, we can see the entry, "War declared at 11 a.m. against Germany." His diary for the following year is mainly blank until we get to May. On the 10th of May, he records, "Hitler invades Holland, Chamberlain resigns, Churchill becomes PM." And the very next day, he reports that he was the first man to join his local Home Guard in Wimbledon. 2 weeks later, he hears of the tragedy that's beginning at Dunkirk, where Allied soldiers were trapped with German troops closing in, and he decides that he's going to do something about it. On the 25th of May, a Saturday, he writes, "Dunkirk, just think of it. All of our sacrifices in the great war to end all wars. Well, I must get there somehow." And so he writes that he puts on his uniform from the First War, puts on his ribbons, and then writes, "What a mess it all seems." But later that night, he returns to his diary. I am well known in Dover, slept the night in Dover Castle. So he made it to Dover, and now it was time to board one of the small boats to get to France. The next day, Sunday the 26th of July, he tells us what happened in his diary. Shipped on board the yacht Rowan, hoving outside Dunkirk beaches was a never-to-be-forgotten night. The place was awash with every kind of small craft, the sands covered with human beings. We got 60 aboard our ship and steamed off again, unharmed by bombs. And having rescued 60 men on that Sunday of Dunkirk evacuations, he returns again the next day, Monday, 27th of May. We returned this time into Dunkirk harbour. As we came out about 5 a.m, a bomb fell near us. I found myself in the sea astern of Rowan. I missed being sucked into some ship's slowly revolving propeller. I was hauled aboard a small fishing boat and was sent on my way home. I find it extraordinary, this man who hears about the outbreak of the First War and leaves his life in Canada to come to England to contribute to the war effort, and then hears about the men trapped at Dunkirk and without a thought heads straight to Dover to see what he can do to help them. In the First War, in his diary, we read of multiple times, 5 or 6 at least, where he's hit or wounded or a shell hits him and he has a genuine near-death experience. And here at Dunkirk, he has that too, when a bomb falls near him and it almost sends him into another ship's propeller. But to him, these are acts he recorded modestly, nobly in these diaries, not intending for anyone to read them. He got back from Dunkirk on the Tuesday at 9 p.m. and the next day he went to work.